Hello, my beautiful creative students willing to try anything. Welcome to watercolor. What is it? Well, watercolor is crushed pigment. So if you think of crushed up rocks of color and we add water, that's basically the idea of what watercolor is. So as for the materials, all you need is your watercolor paints. You only need a few colors. You need a palette to organize all your colors and have an area to mix those colors together. You need some toilet paper or paper towel. I call this artist budget tissue paper. That's to take any extra moisture off your brush when you need a dry brush. And some soft bristled natural hair brushes that are round and that come to a point. You can also use other shape brushes, rectangular brushes, fan brushes, but I find you can do almost everything with these two brushes, a small and a big. The reason why we use natural hair brushes is they hold a lot more liquid, and when you look at them under the microscope, the shape of a natural hair brush is completely different to a synthetic hair brush. And I'll put in a picture of a imaginary microscope view of a hair from a natural hairbrush and a synthetic bristle hairbrush in here. The other material we use is paper. Now, if you've ever tried watercolor before and it hasn't worked, it's probably because you've been using the wrong paper. Watercolor paper is special. It's not like normal paper. It's been treated with a product called sizing, and that helps the water to slowly absorb and not peel the paper or just sit on the surface of the paper. Sizing can be applied by soaking it or spraying it on. So the difference in prices in watercolor paper is reflected in that. So you really want to get the best watercolor paper that you can afford. It's going to have much better sizing. Often people ask what's the right side to use of watercolor paper. If it's the good stuff and it's soaked in sizing, it doesn't matter. You can use both sides. If it's a cheaper version, you really want to try and get the one side that works, and that's just something that you might have to figure out which one works the best with the watercolor paper. But if you can, get the best brand that you can afford. We use a Rains brand watercolor paper in our classes, and that seems to be the best budget version of watercolor paper for students. There's two different ways to use watercolor: wet on dry paper or wet on wet paper, and I'm going to explain both of those to you. It's important to know that I use two different consistencies of paint. So one is thick paint, fresh squeezed out of the tube. I call that Vegemite consistency. It's kind of the texture of Vegemite. The other one is tea. So that's your watery, sloshy kind of pigment. So you put a little bit of color in and you water it down. It's a lot more runny and fluid. That's what I call tea consistency. It's like the consistency of a cup of tea. So to explain the consistencies of watercolor, I've squeezed some fresh paint out. You can see that it's quite thick. That's my Vegemite consistency. If I get some of that and add a little bit of water to it and blend it through, it's a little bit runnier. It'll also be a little bit lighter, because with watercolor, the darker the pigment, we don't use black and we don't use white. We use the white of the paper. So the darker the pigment, that's as dark as that pigment is going to be. When we add water to it, we dilute that pigment and it becomes lighter. So to start off with, if I want to start with a wet on dry technique, I'm going to take some of that thick, freshly squeezed out of the tube Vegemite consistency blue. I'm going to paint that onto my dry paper. Now it's going to stay exactly where I put it because the paper is dry. I'm then going to rinse my brush, dab off any extra water, just using a little bit of water that's on the brush. I'm going to feather that edge. So I'm just touching that edge of that thick blue very lightly, wiggling my brush along, and I should get a nice gradual color. I can do it again, pick up a little bit of that thick Vegemite consistency blue, wiggle my brush along. Eventually the water on my brush will rub out and I should get a lovely, nice graduated color from dark to light. That's wet on dry, starting off with thick Vegemite consistency paint and then moving towards a watery tea version. Glazing starts off with a watery tea version, so I can paint that on here. And then I'm going to let that dry. Once it's dry, I can paint another coat over the top. Now that that color is dry, I can put a second coat, a glaze over the top of it. You'll be able to see the overlapping colors, and you'll be able to see a hard edge where the colors start and stop. I can see where the blue starts and stops underneath, and I can see where the red starts and stops over the top. That is glazing. That's when I've left one color to dry, and then I put a wet one over the top of that. Very similar to that, but totally different, is wet on wet. So wet on wet is when I wet an area of the paper using water or color. And while it's still wet, without letting it dry, if I add in another wet, watery version, I'm going to get a soft edge. So you can't see the hard edge like up here when one had dried and we added another color. Because this blue was still wet, the pink has started to blend into it, and we've got a lovely soft edge or a soft join where you can't see where the blue starts and stops and the red starts and stops. Another version of wet on wet is again wetting the paper with water or with a bit of color. And this time using Vegemite consistency paint. So straight out of the tube, nice and freshly squeezed. When the paint is Vegemite consistency, it's not going to move and bleed as much. It will bleed a little bit, but you'll still get a lovely hard edge where the main paint is. So I've put nice thick red on there. You can see that some of the edges are starting to bleed a little bit, but the main red has stayed still because the blue was wet, but the red was thick paint. Cauliflowers are funny little watermarks on paper that kind of sneak up on you. Sometimes they're beautiful and they're not a thing to fear, but sometimes you want to avoid them, particularly when you're doing a portrait. You don't want a cauliflower on the face. Cauliflowers are formed when you have a wet area of color, also known as a wash, and you add in a little extra water on your brush accidentally. When this wash is almost dry, one side or the edges might start to dry quicker than the inside, and I might accidentally drop some water on there. Let me do that. Or touch the paper and I've got a little bit of water. Hopefully you can see that, but it's pushing some of the pigments to the edges. It doesn't look so bad now, but come back in a few minutes and you're going to notice a big cauliflower shaped mark where it's lighter in the middle and has a little darker fine edge. That's when a wet area that's starting to dry has had a little extra water dropped into it. Sometimes we do that accidentally. I'll show you a sped up version of a cauliflower. Often people ask, how do I know if it's too wet? Well, the best way to do it is to do some trials. So paint some little patches of wet color. When you lift up the paper, hopefully you can see this on the camera, when you can see a shiny surface of water over the paper, it's too wet. It means that if I drop some color in now, it's going to disappear and blend with the other color. So this one's too wet. It's just going to start to move around and blend a little bit too much. Right here, I can see a pool. So if I put some color in there, It's basically just going to move around and sit on the surface of the paper. You can see that that's too wet. When you can start to see the texture of the paper a little bit and it's still a little bit glossy, that's when it's starting to get good. If I wanted to put some thick paint on, it's going to bleed a little bit, but not too much. So this one over here, I can see it's a little bit shiny, but I can still start to see the texture of the paper. If I put some thick paint on it now, it's going to bleed a little bit, but it's not going to bleed too much. This is still wet enough, I can tell, because I can see the texture of the paper and a little bit of gloss, and there's even a little bead of water down the bottom. That's still wet enough for me to add more colour in or re-wet the whole area evenly and adjust the colour if I want to. Once it starts to dry, it's too hard to avoid getting a cauliflower if you just want to adjust one area of colour. Yeah, this is a perfect area now to start adding in more colours if I wanted to. With a little bit of water, I could start to tint some of that colour. If I go in with too much water though, we're going to start to get a cauliflower. So it's all about matching the wetness of the paper. If the paper's a little bit wet, we go in with a little bit of water on our brush. If the paper's really wet, we go in with a lot of water on our brush. If the paper's dry, there's not a lot we can do. If the paper's really, really wet and I add more wet watery colour to it, it's just going to disappear and go everywhere. But if I have wet paper and I add dry paint, it's not going to move around as much. So you try and find that equilibrium by using thicker paint to wetter paper, or if the paper's a little bit drier, we use a little bit more watery paint, sorry. The other thing you can do while the paint is still wet, and it has to still be wet, is to lift some of the colour off. To do that, you rinse your brush and dry it really, really well. And then you can pull some of that pigment off. You might need to do it a few times, but you can only lift out the pigment if the area is still wet. So probably the best thing for you to do now is to do some watercolor drills. Fill out a page like that one. I've got a little PDF that you can print out or draw it up onto your watercolor paper, and start practicing your feathering techniques, start practicing your glazing techniques, start practicing how to get cauliflowers so that you know how to avoid cauliflowers when you want to. Have a play around with putting thick paint onto watery paper and putting watery paint onto watery paper and getting to know the effects. There's a term in watercolor called brush mileage, and that means the more miles you put on your brush, the better you get to know what's going to happen when I put this kind of watery amount of paint onto my paper. What's going to happen if I put this consistency of paint onto my paper? What's going to happen if I wait 5 minutes and it starts to dry? Brush mileage is something that I can't teach you, but the more you do these drills, the more your head's going to start to get around the idea of how wet is too wet, how long is too long to let it dry. It's going to start to get to know how much time your paper gives you, what colours are really, really intense and what colours are really, really light. Remember, we don't use white in watercolour, we leave the white of the paper, and we get our dark colours by using thicker paint, lighter colours by watering it down. The more you play around with that, the more your head's going to get around it. And hopefully that's going to make your watercolour journey a little bit easier and a little bit more fun. All the best!